Great. Okay, let's get started. Or I think we're waiting on one person actually. For those that just joined, go ahead and scan that QR code to make sure you're in a good place to get discount codes of other invite events, all that fun stuff after this. Okay, cool. Let's get started. Once again, welcome. We're really excited to host this event and help you guys land your investment banking interviews. As everyone knows, this is a pretty notorious interview process. It's hard and we're here to help. Let's get started. Okay, brief agenda today. We'll do some quick welcome and introductions, tell you who you are if you haven't heard of Leland before or been to any of our events. Then we will introduce our coaches. We'll dive straight into the panel. We don't have too much time today, and then we'll wrap up. To get started, you'll see some of these people in the chat. My name's Amelia. I run content here. You may see John, Erica, and Izzy in the chat. Erica is our head of experience, and Izzy helps us with events. I'd now like to introduce our incredible panel. Asha is here, but I'll start with Ryan. Ryan, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Ryan Fogarty. I went to school at BYU and studied finance. I did both my summer internship and full-time banking at Lazard. I was a banking analyst in New York City where I was in the consumer and retail group. Then after that, went to TPG where I was in the growth fund, also doing consumer. So I did that for another 2 years, and now I work for a small family office based in Salt Lake City.
Amazing. Anya, would you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sounds good. My name is Anya, and I'm a junior at Duke University. This past summer, I did my sophomore summer internship in the Mergers and Acquisitions group at Bank of America, and I'll be going to Goldman Sachs in their classic investment banking group in New York City this upcoming summer.
Amazing. Asha, would you go ahead and introduce yourself as well as our final panelist today?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late. So hi, everyone. It's great to meet you all. So my background is investment banking at JP Morgan. I spent 5 years in M&A. I started off at Deutsche, spent about a year there, and then moved into JP Morgan, where I spent most of my time in tech and consumer. And then did my MBA, went to Harvard, and then moved into private equity post MBA and started as senior associate at Apex Partners in New York. So I've worked across both the UK and the US.
So cool. Thanks for being here, coaches. As you can tell, they're highly qualified and are sure to provide some great insight in this session. We'd love to get to know you a little bit now that you know us. Go ahead and drop in the chat. Where are you dialing in from? We'd love to see where everyone is from. Usually we get people from all around the world. Pennsylvania, London, Asha, your hometown. University of Florida, Portugal. Okay, truly an international group we've got here. Thanks everyone for being here. I know not everyone is in our time zone, so if it's an inconvenient time, appreciate you being here. Keep them coming. We'll keep looking at them. So to tell you a little bit about who we are, so Leland is your one-stop shop to reach all of your most ambitious goals. This can be across education, career, test, whatever it is. Just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what we do, our bread and butter is one-on-one coaching with experts like this. You can even work with Asha one-on-one after this event. We also host small group classes, community events just like this, and then we also have something called Leland Plus, which is a content subscription. So this is great, right? Well, how does Leland actually work? Let's give you an example. So Max was a Northwestern student. He came to Leland and was looking to break into IB, didn't really have much experience and just wasn't sure where to start. Specifically, he needed help with networking, resume, and interviews. So he wanted a coach with experience in Chicago specifically. So we paired him with one of our experts, Sandra. He worked with Sandra on networking resumes and interviews and just landed a job at JP Morgan in Chicago, which is amazing. This is one use case. Our coaches work with you on anything. The beauty of it is that it is so personalized, whether it's end-to-end, from nothing to an offer, whether it's behavioral or technical interview prep, resume, LinkedIn, networking, all that fun stuff. We've got something for you. Outside of IB too, we also have a ton of coaches for MBA and other grad schools, for private equity and venture capital if you're considering other finance careers. If you're thinking about taking a GMAT, GRE, or other standardized tests, we've got support for you there. Coaching works, you know, it's been a thing that's been around for a long time, and we have kind of condensed it all in one place. As you can see, these are all very, very, very real people who came onto Leland, needed some help, and then landed their goals. Okay, without further ado, thanks for listening to our little spiel. Let's dive right into the panel. Super excited for you guys to hear from these coaches. So to start off with, can you provide an overview of the typical stages and structure of the investment banking interview process? Anya, you recently went through this both with Bank of America and Goldman Sachs. Can you answer this question for us, please?
Yeah, of course. So I think I can split it into two: bulge bracket versus more boutique banks. So with bulge brackets, oftentimes you can go through a diversity process, which might mean you have an accelerated interview, and that might be a higher view, a phone screen, straight to that super day. And when I say super day, that's usually an interview with 2 interviewers interviewing back to back in 20-minute or 30-minute segments. This usually happens over the course of a day. And then another stage might be a first round, a second round, and then leads to a super day. And that first round might be technical, it might not be technical, but usually the interviews have a mix of both questions.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, Asha, I'd love to send this one to you as a former interviewer. What key attributes are you and other interviewers evaluating and looking for during this process?
Yeah, I think for investment banking, I'll start with the analyst interviews and then briefly touch on associate ones, because I did recruiting for both. But when I was hiring analysts for our team, the main thing we were really looking for, that you were well prepared, people who had kind of gone out of their way to get as up to speed as they could on basic finance stuff, but they also knew why they wanted to apply to a particular bank and why they wanted to apply to a particular team. As I'm sure hopefully most of you already know, a bank can have many, many different types of roles. So you need to know which one you're targeting and why you would be a good fit for it. And then having your basics really well prepared. So having your story, your narrative really solid, and your behavioral questions really well done. That's kind of the main thing. I think on the technical side, we don't expect you to know everything, because we're going to teach you a lot of the things that you're going to be doing on the job. But it is the intellectual curiosity part that matters. So can you work through a difficult question if I help you through it during the interview? Or are you, totally out at sea and unable to kind of keep up with the conversation? That would be a more difficult one for me to put someone forward to the next round.
I love that. I think being prepared sounds so obvious, but then so many people aren't fully prepared or don't know quite what being prepared even means. So I really appreciate that answer. Ryan, anything else to add on this point?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really unique about the banking interview process versus other industries is your interviews are most often conducted by people that you're going to be working for directly versus like an HR professional. So they're really evaluating whether or not they feel like they could work with you as an employee for them. And so totally agree with everything that Asha mentioned, like intellectual curiosity, willingness to work hard, knowing what you're getting into. I think all of those things are super important and go a really long way.
Great answers, thanks. Okay, infamous question right at the beginning. Tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. How would you think about answering these questions? Anya, you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, of course. So when they're usually saying, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, they don't mean walk them line through line of every single piece of information that's on your resume. They don't need to hear every single course you've taken, even if you've listed it as a relevant course. The way that I thought about answering the questions was, one, establishing who I am, why I'm there interviewing for that specific role, and what about my past experiences have led me to apply for this role or think that I'm a good candidate. So really introducing myself, where I go to school, what I'm studying, what I do on campus, what internship or extracurricular activities have strengthened my interest in this field. And finally wrapping it up with people I've spoken to at the firm, a specific anecdote that really solidified why I'm here and why I'm a good fit.
Yeah, I like that. Just to maybe double click a little bit more on that. How can someone who's preparing their interviews determine what's information that I should include in this versus not include? Is it what's directly relevant to the interview? Is it what's most important to you? Any guidelines for figuring that out?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Sometimes you might be a general member of an investment club, and that experience might be more tangentially related to investment banking, but might not be as impactful as a startup you worked for, a nonprofit that you really volunteered for and sharpened your analytical and team working skills. So I think it's a bit of both. Being able to express your interest in finance or investment banking show that, as Asha said, that you have some competency and understanding of what goes on in that role, but you don't necessarily have to have a strong investment banking background or finance background to be someone who's able to learn and be a good fit for the internship.
I love that. I think this is also something that a coach can really help with if you're not quite sure where to start and end your story. Okay, next up, you kind of touched on this already, but what advice do you have for nailing the why banking and why this bank in particular questions? Ryan, I'm gonna turn this one over to you.
Yeah, I think to me, the secret tip to nailing this question was the interactions that you have with professionals at the firms before you interview. So I think, everybody is able to access the same information online, whether that be through like the company's or the bank's website or like public filings. But where you can come up with something that's really unique and differentiated is if you're actually taking the time to go and speak with analysts and associates at the firm that work in the exact role that you'll be going into. So my approach was always to focus on like a unique insight that I got from one of those interactions and then explain like how I felt like that would translate into an enriching experience as an analyst and why I wanted to pursue that at the particular firm or the particular group. So I think that's an approach that's pretty easy to replicate for all the different firms, but will allow you to come up with something that's unique and differentiated no matter who you're interviewing with.
I love that because you can find points that are so personal and not something that anyone else is going to say in the interview. Ash, anything else to add on this one? It's kind of an important question.
No, I think Ryan covered it. I feel like this is also one that different banks approach differently, and they want you to have very specific responses to that bank. So the one thing that I spend a lot of time working with people is that if you have an answer prepared that you feel like you can copy and paste for Morgan Stanley and for Goldman and for JP and a boutique bank, most likely that is not a great answer because it's just they know that you've just copied and pasted it and you're going to tell everybody the same thing. So you need to have something that is tailored, and you also have to figure out what each bank values. For example, GS, I know that they value like being entrepreneurial a lot and being proactive a lot. So you have to have that somewhere in your response. JP Morgan, we were much more about willingness to be like learn the technicals and be very analytical. So you have to have that in your response. So I do think you have to spend a lot of time figuring out the nuances between the different banks when you prepare the response to this question.
I love that. That goes so well with Ryan's too. Something that you can ask people when you're interviewing, cold calling people who have worked at the bank before is what do you feel like that firm valued and in your role specifically as well? What other behavioral questions should candidates expect and how should they prepare for them? Anya, going through this process recently, do you want to mention some of the behavioral questions that you were asked?
Yeah, of course. So the way that I approach behaviorals when preparing for banks like Goldman, PJT, Evercore is oftentimes they fall into buckets. So you shouldn't be preparing exact answers for this specific question, but maybe along different themes. So a time you faced a challenge might be a theme that you prepare a question for, but the way that that is asked to you might be a bit different. It might be a time that you failed, a time that you had to work with conflicting ideas, a time that you faced a challenge and had to overcome that. So I would bucket your questions into different type of behavioral themes. So challenges, leadership, working with a lot of data, times that you've taken initiative or been proactive. And I think those have been the most common behavioral questions aside from why this bank, why investment banking, why investment banking over past internships if you have internship experience in other fields, and of course, specific leadership questions about your resume.
I love that. That's great on like bucketing. Think about stories in particular, not specific questions. Ryan, how would you answer the second part of this question? How do you prepare for behavioral interviews? Any best practices there?
Yeah, I think for all of these questions, like practice makes perfect. And so to me, the best way to do it is to find either a coach or someone else that's going through the process with you and just practice as much as possible. And then when it comes to like how you prepare to structure your responses, I think it's always best to think in like bullet points and like very logical linear progressions. So the most common one that you hear about is like a PAR story, so problem, action, resolution. But no matter what the exact structure that you take is, I think just having something that's linear and that has really distinct pieces to your response that get your idea across is the most important thing to keep in mind.
I love that. Your story makes sense to you, but it might not make sense to the interviewer. Ashley, this is an important one. Behavioral questions is obviously a big part. Anything to add?
No, I think maybe the only one thing actually that I would say is that when I work with candidates and we spend a lot of time preparing for this, like Ryan said, definitely practice and it makes you get better at it. But the one thing I feel like people should always avoid in this is when you're really well prepared, you have the perfect answer and you try to figure out a way to fit your answer to whatever question is asked. And you have to make sure you're listening to what they're asking and then adapting the response that you prepared to answer it. So don't just take your perfect answer and just say it word for word. Listen to what they're asking and then adapt your response to it.
Love that. Seeing a lot of nods and agreement. Okay, Asha, I'm going to turn this one back over to you. What are some examples of common brain teaser questions and strategies for solving them?
Yeah, so the main one, and this is hard to prepare in like a week or so, but practice your mental math. That is the one that I would say I use the most, which makes me feel like an evil person, but I actually do just want to test that you can do some level of math in your head, because when you're in client meetings and when you're talking to companies, often they'll just be like, but what if we change this? What does that do to the outcome? And you have to then not be like, oh, let me whip out my Excel and update it and then tell you. You just need to be able to estimate. So you need to get ready and just practice mental math. And most of the brain teasers involve something like that. The other part that you see a lot that, again, we used, that I used both at Goldman Recruiting and JP Morgan, was when we would provide a scenario and ask you to estimate like something ridiculous, like how many golf balls can you fit into a plane or something like that. And there was obviously no perfect way to answer this question. It's more just how do you think? And more importantly, do you absolutely freak out and lose your track of thought and then bomb the rest of the interview? Or do you actually, think it through, rationalize different parts of it and get to a semi-sensible answer and remain composed throughout? I think those will be kind of the two main ones that we used.
I love that. I've heard from a lot of coaches, don't freak out. Whatever you do, don't freak out. Remain composed and, show humility if you're not sure of the answer. Like Asha said too, they're not hiring you expecting you to have all of these skills ready to go. They want to teach you, but in order for them to do that, you have to be teachable. How do you recommend preparing for technical and quantitative portion of IB interviews? Ryan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so fortunately, there are a lot of great resources that are out there for the technical portions of interviews. And like I mentioned before, like practice makes perfect with all this. But to me, I think the biggest differentiator in making someone really stand out in the way that they navigate the technical portion of the interview is when a candidate actually takes the time to go and build these models by themselves before they go into the interviews. Because I think it's one thing to like memorize responses out of a guide, and a very different thing to have like a fundamental understanding of how the different analyses and models work. And I think where you start to see the difference in something that's developed like a really inherent understanding of these concepts is when you get to the more difficult, challenging questions where, like Asha has mentioned, they just want to see how you like think and problem solve through something. So if you've just memorized an answer, you won't be able to do that effectively at all. But if you've actually gone through the process of like trying to do these analyses in your preparation process, then you'll be able to walk through the more challenging questions in a really effective way.
Great insight. Anya or Asha, anything else to add on this one?
No,
Cool.
I actually think that covers it really, really well.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Great. Okay. So we've touched about on this a little bit, but just to go in a little bit deeper, can you share any tips on effectively structuring and presenting your answers to technical questions? Anya, any insight here?
Yeah, so the advice that I got when I was going through the recruiting process and speaking to coaches and mentors was don't go too in depth to the question, really try and answer what they're asking you. You don't need to show off how much information you do know or go beyond the concepts that they're asking in those first questions. Oftentimes they do have follow-ups to that initial question. They want to probe and go deeper. But if you say everything that you know on the first question, then that opens the door to them prodding into concepts that it might sound, oh, you might have memorized this. Let's see if you actually understand the concept, if you understand how pulling this lever might work. I think that can often get you in trouble with questions that you aren't super confident in, them obviously having more work experience and being able to understand if you're not, going down the right road. So I think really structuring it in a way that's exactly what they're asking and waiting for them to follow up if they want more information.
Great advice. Okay, what are some essential do's and don'ts on asking questions to interviewers at the end of the interview? Anya, to go back to you, did you prepare any questions for the end of your interview? If so, how did you think about that?
Yeah, I always had questions prepared. I think nothing is worse than 10 to 15 minutes of awkward silence at the end of an interview. Something that I didn't realize going in, but quickly found out was not all interviewers are trying to fill up that 30-minute or 20-minute time slots asking you questions. It's a bit of a two-way street. You want to understand and convey your interest in the bank, but you also want to understand if that bank is the right place for you. You might not have had the time to do the due diligence of whether it's the right working environment or on that specific person's group. So I think it's a good way to learn more about the group and almost treat it like a coffee chat in that sense of getting a bit more understanding of the group and bank. Some questions that I like to ask are favorite experiences at the bank, experiences that they didn't expect before they hit the desk, something that, they might not have realized during the summer internship or when they were doing coffee chats and recruiting. And another thing I like to ask, especially on the higher level or more senior members, is what really keeps them at the bank and what helps them maintain that competitive edge as the industry constantly evolves.
I like that a lot. Ryan, do you have any do's specifically for asking questions? And then Asha, I'd love to ask you as a former interviewer, any don'ts or like red flags that you've seen in interviews? Ryan?
Yeah, I think one of the more unique pieces of advice that I got that really helps with this is when you're going through the interview process, you should be reading the Wall Street Journal or something comparable every single day. And I think that allows you to develop a really good understanding and really like foster a curiosity about the market and the types of roles that you'll be pursuing. And then when you have that as a background, really just use this opportunity as like truly an opportunity to interact with people that are really interesting and are working on fun and exciting projects. I think particularly when you get to like a super day and you're talking to people that are more senior at the bank, like viewing it as a unique chance to sit down with someone who's like at the pinnacle of their field and doing something really interesting day in and day out just helps you come up with genuine questions and helps you kind of demonstrate that intellectual curiosity that they're going to be looking for.
I like that a lot. Asha, don'ts or red flags or anything to add on the other two?
Yeah, I actually thought Annie had great questions. I think those are the kind of questions that I would get. I was like, okay, this person genuinely wants to know more. The things that I would say definitely don't do. I think some people are okay with this, but I feel very strongly about it. I really didn't like when people were like, what is your typical day like? What does that, because it's just, to me, if you have done your basic level of research into what banking is like, there is no such thing as a typical day. It is so project dependent. It's so dependent on what type of deal you're working with, who you're working with, what team you're working with, what country you're working in, that there really isn't one like that. So I feel like that's a very generic question. I also think you shouldn't be asking something that you could get from the website, right? So if you feel like you need to ask, okay, what were the last 3 deals that you did? I definitely don't recommend that because that's something you should have researched. So you should know the answer, not the person who's interviewing you. So I think be thoughtful about it. Ask something that you can't find out from somebody else, and you use it in a valuable way, because this is also your time to figure out whether you want to work for this bank at all. So ask the questions that are on your mind in that time that you have.
Yeah, that's great. Something I've heard is don't ask anything that you can find the information to on the website, definitely, but also anywhere on Google. Think about the person in front of you. What is their specific value can they bring to the conversation? What can they alone answer for you and provide a unique perspective on? Thanks, guys. That was great. Are there any other interview etiquette recommendations you have for candidates? I'll open this to all of you. There's some basics, but we can touch on them, like send a thank you note after. Anything else, Ryan, you want to start with this?
Yeah, I think a basic one is like professional dress. And the best piece of advice that I got on that was you should you should never leave an interviewer remembering what you wore. Like if you wore something flashy enough that they like remember what your tie was or what your coat or your shirt was, then generally that's a problem because they're remembering you for the wrong reasons. I think that's another like really basic one where like if you do that wrong, it doesn't really matter how the interview goes. There are just certain things that'll kind of put an X next to your name no matter what.
That's great. Anya, anything to add here?
Obviously show up on time, probably 3 to 5 minutes early. Don't show up 15 minutes to the Zoom call and the person's been waiting there for you to show up. Also, on kind of don't questions to ask. What I always heard is like don't make presumptuous statements. Don't ask like what's the return rate, how many, like when will I find out if I have the internship? A lot of the time the interviewers aren't HR, might not have a lot of visibility into that process, and that's not something that, they're really helpful to speak to. That might be something that you reach out to the HR rep who coordinated your super day, but it's not really taking good advantage of their time.
Yeah, absolutely. Ash, any other etiquette tips?
I think the main one for me, and it's, I guess, less etiquette, but just how you respond is I am big on body language. And when I work with candidates, that's something am laser focused on. If you're someone who's always twirling your hair, if you're somebody who is like always fiddling or touching your face, you have to figure out a way to just reduce that. I also think the small thing, if it's a Zoom interview, just be sensible about like your background. It shouldn't be a super messy bedroom that you're sitting in front of. I've had that when people have interviewed over Zoom, and be conscious like you're in a professional interview, so you should be in a professional setting. Have a fake background if you have to do it from your bedroom. But I think small things like that actually make a huge difference when you have the volume of applicants that most of these banks have.
Yeah, that's great. I think I just add, remember they're looking to hire someone who, and if they hire you, you'll be a representation of their brand. So you have to be, everything has to be so that you satisfy that brand's requirements. So you meet the basics, be a normal human, show up on time, be respectful. What about having a copy of your resume in hand?
So
Yeah.
I'm actually, oh, okay. I'm a little split on this. I feel like you should have it in your bag. Do not have it in your hand because I'm just like, if you're asked, it's good to be prepared. But I find it a bit odd when people walk in with a printed copy because I'm like, well, I already know it. And are you telling me that I have to reread it or I have to have it or I have to ask you questions from your resume? So I'd rather you just had it with you in case I needed it. But your assistant normally prints it for you before you go into an interview, so it's not something that I feel like you need to provide usually.
I think that's a great response because I was the interviewer running in having not read the resume, but if you have it in your bag, you can work for both me and Asha in that case. So
Have a resume, put it in your bag. Got it.
yeah.
And make sure the resume is perfect, by the way, too, right? Like not a single error on there, no spaces where there shouldn't be, fonts aligned, perfect alignment, all that fun stuff. We're going to talk about resumes. Okay, common mistakes that candidates should avoid during the interview process. I'd love to just go to each of you and maybe list one mistake if you have one that you've seen or that you've tried to avoid in your case, Anya. Asha, you want to start? We've touched on some of them, so if there's nothing
Yeah,
to
I feel like we've touched on quite a few of these already. I think for me, it's just you're going to get better as you go through the process. So if you really have banks you just want the most out of any other bank, save it to the end if you can, right? Like, do use your practice banks in like smaller banks or in the ones that you don't like as much or teams that you don't really want to join as much. And then the more you do it, by the time you're interviewing for your dream role at the dream bank, you're gonna be really, really good. So I feel like most people overdo it and end up with that. The other thing is cannot prepare early enough. I am pretty picky on who I work with. And I'm grateful enough to be in that position, but I do not like working with people as much who turn up to me like the day before and they're like, oh, I have this interview coming up. Can you help? There's very little I can do to help at that point. And so I would rather that you reached out to me a month, 6 months, even a year in advance, and we did some prep just slowly. rather than we try to kind of cram a bunch of it right before your interview the night before. It's just you're not going to remember anything by the time your interview comes around.
Yeah, that's great. And you may think you know what help you need, but until you're in front of an expert, you may not totally know what you should be working on. Ryan, any common mistakes?
Yeah, a big one that like I've seen several times is when a candidate assumes the role of the person that they're speaking with, and it's like too junior, just completely incorrect. So what you have to realize about a lot of these firms is they're very young people that end up getting senior very quickly because they're meritocracies and young people just get promoted quickly and do really well at these firms. And so like having a director or managing director walk in and be like, oh, are you an analyst at XYZ firm is like a very bad way to make a first impression and actually happens a lot more than you would think. So common mistake that is definitely one to avoid.
Yeah, that's great. I haven't heard that before. Anya, anything to add here?
I think two kind of small ones are one, if you mention someone that you've spoken to during the interview, there is a chance that, your interviewer might know them, might go and ask them, how'd your coffee chat go? So always be careful to make a good impression in your coffee chats and your informal calls, because, they might take that opinion or consideration into feedback during your interview. And then secondly, I would just say, try and make sure that you're not mixing up things or names between different banks. I know there are a lot of interviews that happen at the same time, but if you are talking about, a generalist offer and you're interviewing at Goldman, which doesn't give generalist offers, that automatically shows, you weren't being very attention focused or diligent, and that kind of is a red flag. And then finally, just people underestimate the airplane test. You want to have your technicals nailed. Think that's something that you can study, but it's really important to come across as likable, as friendly, as someone who's really excited to be there, because you have a lot of students interviewing at one time and you want to show that you're grateful for the opportunity. And I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, that's great. For those of you who haven't heard of the airplane test, it's could I handle 8 hours alone in the airport with this person? If the answer is yes, you've passed. If no, maybe reconsider. Great. I want to touch on this last one. What are some of your final recommendations for success? If you have like one tip or one thing that you really want everyone in this session to walk away from to really nail their interviews, what would you tell them? Anya, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I think to nail your interviews, as Asha was saying, you can have your dream bank, but if you don't get that bank, it isn't the end of the world. Don't let that throw you off your game. It's important to approach everything with, a good attitude, be excited. Just because it might not be your dream role, your first job is not where you're going to end your career. And I think having that mindset takes a lot of pressure out of the interview process. Just given timelines are so expedited, you might not even know what you want. So I think that there's a lot of time to figure out your career, and you shouldn't put too much pressure on yourself, or else that can cause unnecessary stress and make the application process and interview process much more difficult than it has to be.
Yeah, that's great. I hope everyone here takes a deep breath after that advice. Ryan, what's your number one recommendation or tip to walk away from?
Yeah, I would say don't like half commit to the recruiting process. So if you decide to do it, like really fully dedicate yourself and invest the time that's required. And as a part of that, I would just mock interview as much as possible with people that are qualified to give good feedback and to help you along in the process.
Yeah, that's great. I actually read a study yesterday that doing a mock interview can 3 to 4x your chances of success, which is insane. I mean, if there's one thing you should do a mock interview. Asha, last tip, final recommendation.
I think I'm just gonna repeat myself a little bit here, but prepare early. I just think you to start as early as you can, because it gives you time to do well, and it gives you time to really make sure that you are prepared for all the different banks. You have customized your responses, and you're in a place to really perform your best, so that even if you don't get that one or two offers that you really feel like you want, you still have a solid backup, and you tried your best, which I think makes you feel a lot better about yourself than if you just made a half-hearted attempt, like Ryan said.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you, coaches. Such good answers. We actually have a couple of minutes, really excited. So we can actually take some questions from the viewers. If you guys want to drop questions in the chat, we can go through as many of them as we can. One that I want to start with, because I know a lot of people, we had some people actually submit this question. What are some examples of more difficult technical questions that they might hear? I think a lot of people are really nervous about the technical section in particular. So common questions and anything else maybe that we want to touch on. with insight to technical interviews specifically. Anya, technical interview questions, what were some that you heard or struggled with?
I had a kind of variety of questions. I had everything from walk me through the three financial statements to, advanced accounting, paper LBOs during the interview. So I think it really, really depends on the type of bank. Goldman is not specific, like aggressively technical, but if you're interviewing for a restructuring group at an investment bank, you might get questions that are very specific to the industry. So I think technical difficulty, you can look in the expert section of the M&I, but a lot of ways to prepare for unexpected questions is replacing the numbers in the M&I questions with different numbers and seeing how it flows through. So you're understanding conceptually instead of understanding or memorizing the process.
Yeah, that's great. Ryan, common interview questions and or general technical interview prep insight?
Yeah, I think like when I was interviewing at Lazard, what we would view as like the hardest questions that we would ask candidates, and what I think is pretty common across M&A groups and the other like boutique firms like Evercore and Centerview that are M&A focused, is giving like mini M&A case studies. So for example, like you have company A with this set of financials, company B with that set of financials. Let's assume company A is buying company B for a mix of 50-50 cash and stock. What is that going to do to their accretion or dilution? And so like those types of things where, and that's kind of why I mentioned the comment earlier about like building the models, like that the answer to that question is not like found in a guide somewhere. But if you've like gone through the process of working through it, then you can like problem solve your way through the question with your interviewer.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Asha?
I think Ryan's point was probably really, really fulsome on that one. I think that's probably the hardest one I would give. I would also push a little bit on just fundamental understanding of finance. I feel like sometimes people have a surface level understanding, and once I start digging into how well you really understand working capital, I feel like that's when you realize that not that many people studied beyond, what is the definition of a working capital formula. So I think just very basic finance knowledge, but stuff that you can go deeper into is what I would really value.
Yeah, that's great. Someone asked about GPA, but I'd actually like to expand it a little bit further. If someone has some kind of issue that they see in their candidacy, whether it's lack of experience, maybe they're newer to finance or in a non-finance or technical degree, or they have a lower GPA, how could you, if you still want to get into investment banking, how would you recommend overcoming some of these deficiencies? Asha, as a former interviewer, I'd love your insight here.
So I think on this one, the thing that I work the most with people on is really just getting your narrative right. So you have to get that story in the part where they say, tell me about your background. Okay, so that's the most natural point for it to usually go. If you don't, then there's a chance that they'll be like, well, explain your GPA to me. And then it's less of a proactive approach, because then you're justifying yourself and you will automatically find that you're a bit more defensive than if you'd just been front-footed about it at the beginning. So I do think that, if you have a good reason for it, tell them that reason at the beginning. Tell them like you went through this, but keep it short. Make a point about it and then move on. They don't need to know the entire story, but they need to have a sense of there was a reason why it happened, and this is what you learned from it, or this is how you recovered and you got to where you are now. If they're interviewing you, they're already looking at you as a potential person that they might want to work with. So if you're getting to a point that they're interviewing you, you have to take that confidence in with you that your GPA was easy enough for them to overlook, which is why you're there in the first place.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we have a lot of people who want to hear the answer to this question. How do you convert networking into interview opportunities? Ryan, any tips here?
Yeah, I think it's really important to ask, like, and to just register and demonstrate your interest. But I think that, if your networking efforts are going well and you express interest, then you'll be on the list for the interviews that happen. And so I think like for schools that have a pretty established pipeline, you might be interviewing and networking people and then understand like that the process is actually kicking off. And that's usually a good time to reach back out to the people that you have met with and like remind them that you had a positive interaction with them so that they can pull you into the process. But if you don't have like a school that, you can tell a process is kicking off, just like paying attention to what other schools are doing, or even like online resources are indicating, and you can kind of get a sense that a bank is starting to go. I think like reaching back out just to say, hey, I just dropped my resume, you know, really appreciate the conversation that we had a couple months ago and X, Y, and Z about that. Then that might just be like the prompting that they need to pull your resume into the process, or to remind themselves that they really liked you when you had the interaction.
Yeah, such great advice. And I guess adequately prepare for your networking sessions so that they're willing to advocate for you later on.
Yeah, for sure.
Such great advice, coaches. I, for one, feel totally ready for my investment banking interviews. Thanks so much for your time. I know we couldn't get to all those questions. I'm sorry we ran out of time. If you guys could join me in thanking our coaches. You can also work with Asha in particular on your investment banking interview prep. We also have a ton more banking coaches on Leland. You can scan that QR code to go straight to her profile. Ryan, Anya, and Asha, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time and insight. Want to give a quick thing. We are doing a really special discount code today only. It ends at midnight. We're doing 20% off your first month of a subscription. So how this works is if you want support, but you're not sure where to start, or you don't know what's the perfect coach for you, you can actually go on Leland. You can scan that QR code right there. You can choose a level, a tier of the subscription, as well as how frequently you want to meet with your coach. As Asha said too, as early as possible. So if you're earlier, this is definitely something that you want to look into. We'll then match you to a coach, and then you'll be able to meet with your coach, and you can switch to one if it wasn't a great fit. Again, this ends at midnight today. So if this is something you're interested in, or you want help on your investment banking interviews, highly recommend checking this out. The link is in the chat as well if your QR code isn't working. Thank you so much for being here, especially those. I had someone tell me that they were in Switzerland and it's 1 a.m. there. Really appreciate you all being here. Go ahead and sign up for Leland if you haven't already. We do a lot of events like this. If you want invites to them, then you need to have an account. Go ahead and book time with a Leland coach. Someone asked why Leland compared to other things. Leland is the only thing that's personalized. You know, you can cold call the LinkedIn, but they don't really have your back. They're not super invested. A Leland coach has your back. They want you to succeed, and they have the expertise to do so. We only accept about 2 to 3% of coaches, so they're really high quality. We also have tons of free resources and guides. We actually have an article on the top 20 technical interview questions to follow up on that, so highly recommend checking that up. And then go and nail your upcoming interviews. We are on your team. The whole Leland team is really excited and rooting for you. And if you do get through and you get an offer, please let us know. We love celebrating your successes. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you.
See ya.